The CD&A, the compensation discussion and analysis. This heart of hearts disclosure in your proxy about executive pay might take up as much as a third of the pages that comprise your proxy. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Broc and I'm a big fan of yous. Before I bring in our guests, Gillian and Raj, let me mention a few of the basics. CD&A is a principles-based disclosure requirement. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The scope of the CD&A is any NEO executive compensation arrangement. I have a separate vid guide about how you determine who your named executive officers are. Those are the NEOs. But I will typically include a group of 5 officers, perhaps as many as 9, and it will include your CEO and your CFO. But it could wind up being your entire senior management team as you describe what you're doing with your compensation in your CD&A, because this is a principles-based disclosure requirement. The CD&A presents current as well as post-employment compensation, as well as any material information that's presented in the tables in your proxy, the executive pay tables. So all the executive pay disclosure, the pay data you have in the proxy gets tied up neatly in a bow in the CD&A. Here are 7 questions, 7 line items in item 402B1 that draws out what your CD&A must explain as the material elements of a company's compensation package for their NEOs. So you must answer these 7 questions within your CD&A. And I find it's useful to reread these questions each year before you put pen to paper for your upcoming CD&A. So in addition to addressing the 7 enumerated questions, the CD&A must also address any other information that's material to a shareholder's understanding of the executive pay program by considering these 15 examples. It's sort of a useful guide to help you draw out further information that you must address in the CD&A. That's why the CD&A gets to be so long. And now we're ready for our guest. Gillian Emmett Moldowan is a partner of Shearman & Sterling in New York. Gillian's practice is broad, compensation, governance, ERISA. Look for my separate vid guide where Gillian and I discuss human capital management disclosures. And then Raj Dave is Vice President, Chief Securities Counsel, and Assistant Corporate Secretary for Newell Brands, also in New York City. Raj has been in-house counsel for 4 different public companies, so he has a wealth of practical experience. I'm Broc Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So this CD&A, the heart of the proxy, the heart of executive pay disclosure. So Raj, this is a principles-based disclosure. What does that mean, principles-based?
So to me, that means that the technical rule, which is found in section 402B of Regulation SK, is just the starting point. One who's drafting a CD&A really has to look at what disclosure would be consistent with the spirit or the intent of the rule, not just the black letter law, and try to think about what a reasonable investor would find interesting or important, or within the company, what would the comp committee or the head of HR or the folks in legal know is important to providing context or the information behind the disclosure, not just the black letter law.
Yeah, and it was interesting when the SEC decided to do it like this, because it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that I think that some of the disclosure requirements that the SEC has put out are disclosure-based requirements, and it's just a novel thing, particularly in this area where the disclosure is so sensitive. You're talking about your CEO's compensation. It's very sensitive to be describing that in the proxy. It's your boss's boss's boss kind of thing. And so you always got to be careful about what you're going to say. So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing on principles-based disclosure that I think is always worth noting when talking about the CD&A is that it creates a circumstance where you don't have a form document the way you do with a 10K, for example. So each proxy statement with their CD&A looks different, and when you're seeking information, you find it in different parts, and it gets to the importance of creating a narrative structure that meets the needs of the particular company as well.
So I think this is one of the reasons why the CD&A gets to be so long, is that because with the principles-based analysis, you get really free reign to create a story, and you're telling a story. And of course, some of the compensation arrangements are pretty complex, so that when you're telling that story, you have to tease out all the various elements in it to make that story something that is fully comprehensive and understandable.
Certainly, yeah. there's a lot of context each year, and so the length will vary from year over year. Sometimes you'll have a year when there were a lot of developments and a lot of things that would be, material to investors. And then there are some years that are very, very straightforward, both in terms of the payouts and what the comp plans were when the length of the document might be shorter.
And I think that really goes to the importance of not taking a cut and paste approach with the CD&A as a drafter, and each year looking at it. And of course, there'll be parts that are consistent from year to year and you may bring over, but when you take that first crack at the CD&A for a year, to take that step back and say there might be different parts this year, we may need to reorder things because in fact the facts were different with our plans and programs this year.
So Gillian, Ross just mentioned about things that are material to investors. What is materiality in this context for CD&A?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you look at the rule itself in 402, it does indicate that the compensation discussion and analysis is supposed to explain all the material elements of the compensation of the named executive officers. And it goes through in the rule what examples might be of what's material. But when you get to the heart of it, it's a facts and circumstances analysis for the particular registrant in terms of what is material to an investor's understanding of the compensation that's being disclosed in the tables. And that's a pretty specific type of materiality. It has to be material for the investor and not necessarily just the company or the individual. And that's important because sometimes there can be compensation elements that are quite small numerically, for example, and a company might say, well, from the registrant's perspective, it's not all that material, a car allowance or something of that nature. But here what we're talking about is an investor's understanding of the compensation program. And certainly for an investor to understand all the elements of a compensation program, teasing those out, even when the numerical amounts may be small, can be important. So here we're really looking at that understanding of what's going to show up in the tables. And also being thoughtful, I think, about what may be best described as not providing or being careful about not having material omissions, because if something has changed or there's extra information that would be helpful to people, investors understanding the programs, it's important to reference that as well. And certainly when you think about any potential changes from the end of the year through to the proxy publication date, that issue of materiality is key, because the CD&A overall is really looking at 1 year of compensation, but you are supposed to bring forward any material information that's happened since the end of the year that would help people understand the program more completely.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm asking someone a trick question when I talk about materiality, because it's the most challenging part of being a lawyer, of being in this area of law. It's really a difficult question to answer in some cases. Some cases, of course, it's very easy, but there's often a lot of gray area and how close you get to the line or push the envelope and perhaps go over the line. That's especially here where, again, the disclosure is so sensitive. So Raj, how do you provide the analysis in the CD&A? What's the context for that?
So the analysis and context are critical, I think, to a good CD&A, and to do that, I think you have to provide not just the what of a comp decision, but also the how, the why, and the so what. And that means, to me, looking at comp decisions and thinking about how an investor should view these decisions. Why were they made? Were particular comp decisions made in response to investor concerns, in response to retention concerns, things like that. It's been about 15 years since the CD&A rules came out, and I think investors really look at these disclosures in a continuum, looking at previous year's CD&A of a company as well as peer companies' CD&As. And so it's important to understand and situate comp decisions to the extent there's context, so that people can pick up on those things quickly. And secondly, I think the analysis is important, and you can give that by connecting the dots between particular disclosures that might be in the tables and in the rest of the document, or in the forepart, and those decisions, talking about things that might be going on in the business, internal and external factors, and what happened with the performance, for example. And that analysis helps investors understand the context behind the pay decision, whether it was high, low, or neutral, and what else might be going on with the pay programs. And I think that's really the substance of the document, is to provide that context so that when they get to the tables, they're able to sort of understand what's in those tables better.
Do you know on average how many different proxies you actually review over the course of the year, so you can compare what your company is doing against others?
That's a good question. I think in the beginning, there's probably 3 or 4 companies that folks on our board and folks in management really look at, because we view them as peers. As we move through proxy season and building up to proxy season, if issues are emerging, or companies that are September 30th fiscal year end companies, they might come out with disclosures earlier than the 12/31 fiscal year end companies. That helps us get context when there's a new rule or a new area that people are focused on. And then obviously when we get in, shareholder proposals come in and proxy season votes start coming in, and we have to look at where we might need to enhance or where we might need to beef things up. We're looking at companies who have handled those particular issues. So somewhere between 5 to 10, Broc.
Yeah, I think Microsoft is in a unique position because they do such great disclosure, but also they're a 630 company, and so their proxy will be coming out probably over the next. Well, we're taping this right now in August, so it'll probably be out in the next month, and that's one that I always read. Very interesting. It's just interesting how what fiscal year end you are really matters in terms of how big an influencer you might be on the other companies during the course of that year for those hot topics.
Yeah, and I think this year that'll be particularly interesting. That's something I've been thinking about and talking to colleagues about, because these fall filers often actually get to see other disclosure when new rules come out. They're not necessarily the first disclosures when we have new rules, but under the current circumstances with changes that companies may have implemented in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic, we may be seeing a lot of these fall proxy statements as some of the earliest fulsome explanations of changes for COVID-19. And I think that should be an interesting thing to see in the fall season.
Raj, one interesting component of the CD&A is when you get risk involved in the disclosure when it comes to executive pay. How does that work?
Yeah, risk is an important component of when you're drafting a CD&A. Obviously, there are other sections of the proxy statement that are dedicated to talking about how the incentive programs may or may not incentivize risk. But in the CD&A, I really like to think of it as, let's talk about the pay mix, how much of the pay was at risk in terms of the overall comp package. And in a given year, why weren't certain bonus targets and metrics slam dunks? What were the factors that went into creating risk around achievement of particular goals that resulted in a payout? Because my experience with shareholder outreach is that investors are trying to understand the risk-reward payoff with respect to a current, a particular year for named executive officers. And that's within the greater context of the risk-reward equation that they have as investors with the money that they've invested. So I think risk is important to put an emphasis on when you're talking about the pay program, as well as the particular awards in a year, and to provide that context so people can see the pay for performance nexus.
Gillian, how much disclosure should companies provide about the compensation setting process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the compensation setting process itself, I think, is at the heart of the CD&A. So you want to be complete on this, but it's also something I think that in many good CD&As can be done in a fairly concise way. Also watching for consistency throughout the proxy statement, because proxy setting process is going to indicate who was part of the team that made determinations, the compensation committee, outside advisors like consultants, the board itself in certain instances, and then members of management to the extent of other NEO compensation. You have descriptions of some of those processes in the disclosure that you make in the proxy statement with respect to the committee responsibilities, So I always like to be thoughtful in looking at a CD&A to make sure there's consistency between those two sections of the proxy statement. And when you're in the CD&A, again, I think you want to be thorough, but this is a place that I think you can do well concisely by identifying who were the members of the team, what was the schedule like, and how did they each participate in the process. You can then get into the specificity of setting things like performance measures or compensation amounts when you get into the sections in the CD&A on each element of the compensation. I find that can be very effective.
So Gillian, how do you describe benchmarking practices?
Yeah, I think benchmarking, that's an important word to be thoughtful about when you use and cognizant in the CD&A. Benchmarking has a very specific meaning, in particular to the SEC and the staff when they comment on proxy statements. When you talk about benchmarking, I think there's an expectation from the staff on their review of proxy statements that there will be clear indicators of peer groups, what type of benchmarking did the company do, which elements of pay were benchmarked and how. So when you use that word, I think you want to be thinking about, are you a company that benchmarks that way? As opposed to perhaps more general marketplace studies or peer review studies. And you can describe that as well, and of course should describe it if that's your practice, but you might want to be careful about using the word benchmarking if in fact what the company is doing is more generally looking at broad studies and then making decisions about their own compensation.
I just add here that when a company's benchmarking process changes, that's often considered material. So for example, if a company divests a number of businesses such that it hits a different comp peer group or comp benchmarking group, or if you have a significant market cap change or even an ownership change that might make the comp consultants or the benchmarking decisions, different as they look at the company.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point as well, to be thoughtful. And Raj, going back to a point you made about CD&A, the why. A lot of times you'll see changes in peer groups, and I think really good proxy statements in CD&As give you that information about why the peer group shifted. So not just that the compensation consultant perhaps recommended a shift in peer group, but they recommended that shift because certain companies were no longer in the right industries or the right size. And that explanation, I think, can be very helpful in a section on peer group assessment and benchmarking.
So Gillian, how far do you have to drill down when you're disclosing the details about performance target levels?
Yeah. Performance target levels, I think this, at the end of the day, is probably the section of the CD&A where I spend the most time with clients really deep in the weeds of figuring out how to disclose this, because performance and how you pay for performance is essential. It is possibly one of the most material aspects of compensation program and program design, and also one of the most sensitive. In particular, if the performance metrics themselves contain corporate objectives or goals that the company really does feel are not ready for disclosure or would be negatively impactful to the company to indicate in too much detail about what those performance indicators are. You also, of course, have to be ready for the fact that even at the end of a performance period, when you may, as a company, be fine with disclosing the performance indicators, that things may not have gone as planned. And so be ready for having a sometimes difficult discussion about why certain performance indicators were set and the fact that they may not have been achieved. So you do see, I think, a range in terms of the depth of performance detail in proxy statements. And a lot of that can do with timing. Are you talking about it at a time where the performance period is still ongoing, or are you talking about it at a time when the performance period has ended? And also, if you have more of a focus on performance measures that are already publicly disclosed, like financial measures that are in the public domain, or whether you're talking about performance indicators that, other than in the CD&A, would not be disclosed. Those could be individual performance indicators that can be extremely sensitive, of course, as well as business unit performance, number of items sold or something of that nature where that particular information isn't yet public. So this is a tricky area, and one that I do think takes a good bit of time to prepare and prepare well. But companies should, of course, keep in mind that this is also an area that is, generally speaking, deemed material by the staff. And if there isn't sufficient disclosure in the performance indication area, that can be a place you can get comments.
And of course, the SEC staff might not pull your proxy for review, but you still have the proxy advisors, the institutional investors who care a lot about this disclosure, I imagine. And if you have deficient disclosure, that's going to be as bad as having good disclosure, but details that they don't want to see, and you might get a vote against on your comp committee members or even maybe the entire board.
Absolutely. And I think that that is a great point, Broc, that you want to be thoughtful in your drafting about your readership. Who are your readers? So you have the SEC staff, but you also have your investors at large, you have an analyst, and then you have the proxy advisors themselves. And in performance, that's an area I think that irrespective of how deep you're willing to go, if you spend some time with it, you can craft disclosure that is at least speaking to the proxy advisors and letting them know how you're using performance, and at least hopefully sway them towards understanding your program and why you have linked pay for performance, even if you're in a circumstance where you can't go as deep as they may otherwise be pressing you to go.
I'd say one point on that, which is a practice tip, is you may start your CD&A in December, and actually when it's released is typically shortly after your earnings for the fiscal year. And so make sure you harmonize your disclosure in your earnings call script or your 10K MD&A, things like that, with the message in the MD&A, because the CD&A, because the message around performance is being read by those stakeholders that Gillian mentioned in that order and kind of with that consistency. So if you start off too early and maybe you don't get that context in there, then there's maybe some explaining to do later.
Yeah, and I think that forward-looking performance pointer or practice pointer is a great one. Also, as another practice pointer, I would say for companies, see if as you go through the compensation year, if you can just write short riders to yourself of what your proxy disclosure in the CD&A may look like when you put a particular plan in place, particularly performance-based plan. Because as I think many of us who do this all the time know, there's usually quite a lot of discussion about performance indicators and how they're determined and why they're determined that way. It really is, in so many cases, and certainly in my experiences with clients, a really thoughtful exercise that involves the HR team, it involves legal, the board, and others, finance. Sometimes when you get to the actual writing of the CD&A, it may be left with legal, for example, to be doing all of that writing without the benefit of the rest of that team. If when you're setting these performance indicators, which could be in March of a year, and you're not going to be writing your CD&A until December, if you could just ask the team to write a one-pager together that you hold for December, it can really be a great jumpstart and add a lot of real content and meaty content that can be used in the disclosure.
So in a way, you might be writing your CD&A ad hoc style, but on a year-round basis as you're making changes to your pay program. Yeah, great point. So Gillian, what about disclosing equity grant practices?
That's an interesting one. I think if you go to 402, there's actually quite a lot of items there that are noted as potentially material about grant timing, otherwise. I think, at least with what I generally see, companies have fairly standardized granting practices in terms of timing and their mix. This particular disclosure is expanded, I think, in years when there's been shifts by the company, either if they're doing special grants, and this might be a year actually that we see a lot more disclosure about that because there were moves during it's certainly the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic of shifts from cash to equity, and many companies maybe did off-cycle grants and granting there. Or if you're having a big shift For instance, if you haven't used a performance unit historically and you're adding a performance unit to your mix, or if you're reducing your reliance on options, there's quite a lot of disclosure that you'll see and should see about why companies are making the decision to move between the different equity pay mix, and then also in particular if there's changes in timing of equity awards in your calendar.
So this is a good time for me to mention that I actually have separate vid guides on all the different components of the executive pay that feed into the CD&A. And one that vid guide I just taped is about the change in control severance section. Usually it's in tabular format. It's actually not required to be in a table, but most companies do put tables in their proxies. But Gillian, what in the CD&A, how do those post-employment arrangements look?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think an interesting one too, because I think that actually, to the extent that you have a severance program or employment agreements that were not changed during the past year, you can actually move a lot of that to the disclosure on post-employment and change of control arrangements, the narrative there. And people sometimes forget, if you go into 402, it says in each table, and provide a narrative description of what's happening here. And a lot of times companies put some footnotes as they need, but really are relying on the CD&A as the narrative description there. Post-employment and change of control arrangements are a place that I think you can really move out of the CD&A in many, many cases if they haven't been changed in the last year, which allows you to condense the CD&A, focus on what it is meant to describe, which are things that happened in the year that you're talking about for the most part, and can move these very long, often detailed descriptions that you need of people employment agreements, but move that back to the table closer to where people are going to see the nuts and bolts of those. So in a year when you haven't had changes in this area, I think you can be fairly concise on these points and refer your readers back to the table. In a year when you have a new arrangement in place, then it's going to take up a lot more space in the CD&A, and rightfully so, because these arrangements in particular, if you have new executives who got new employment agreements, or you're shifting your approach to change and control arrangements, that's something that you do want to explain what the compensation committee, and in these instances, especially when you're talking about the CEO, the whole board may have been thinking to make those types.
That's a great point, Gillian. I'd just add, in a year when you had a CEO or a named executive officer leave, it sometimes is important to put some context around the employment arrangement, to give context to what are the investors and other stakeholders going to see in the tables. Why was he or she paid out the way he or she was? And were there any additional things that might have been added? Was it outplacement, a little bit of change in the approach? When are the payments going to be made? Some of the fine points become very important, particularly if there's anything that's going to be in the all other compensation column or the summary comp table. Providing some context would be important.
I think that's a great point. And as a kind of drafting practice pointer, there's some really effective proxy statements that when they have an executive who's leaving, they actually say right up front in the CD&A, this CD&A is about our named executive officers. Our named executive officers are the following individuals, including such a person who left. And so therefore, as you read through the rest of this, we aren't going to be talking about that person until we get to the section at the end that is all about that person who left, and pulling that aside. It, of course, will depend on when they left during the year, the facts and circumstances, but that can be really effective, because the alternative that you sometimes see is when you get into each element of the compensation, the description, you'll see that it says, here's what we did for everyone except this individual. They weren't qualified for a bonus this year. Their equity all forfeited, whatever happened. And it's nice to set that stage up front for your readers, and then you can come back to and do a whole nice concise section on that individual who left, really explaining those elements that Raj was just discussing that are so important about what did they get paid in relation to, was it a preset arrangement or new arrangements, etc. So
say on pay, Raj, how do you describe last year's say on pay vote in this year's proxy, and then how that vote went against, what is that vote's impact on our current pay program?
That's an important section for investors typically. And for issuers that have had a generally similar trend of approval from their investors, it may be a small section in the CD&A, basically saying, hey, we've had 92% support year over year for the past couple of years. And we think that that evidences support amongst our investors of the way we're paying our executives. I think it becomes very important when you have a change in that support level. And typically, it's when it goes down year over year. What's happening with that trend, and how did that result inform changes that the comp committee may have made to the executive pay programs? And what did you hear from your investors through investor outreach as to why that vote was lower? In terms of placement, typically, actually, in the more recent years, we've been moving that disclosure up to the executive summary of the proxy statement as well, because it's of so much interest to investors who are thinking about voting for your pay program in the next year, and having it in the CD&A as well with the messaging that's going on there. But clearly, I think, Broc, it's important for companies to be right out front and very upfront about this issue, because although non-binding, the say on pay vote is a very strong sort of endorsement or referendum on the executive pay as a manifestation of the performance of the company. And so a succinct and often detailed bullet point approach to what happened and what are we doing, I think, is very critical.
So one of my favorite parts of any proxy statement is a short list of bullets about what are the changes. It could be in the proxy summary, and you're talking about what's new this year for us completely in the proxy, or it might just be or both in your pay section where you're describing what are the changes in our pay program from year to year. Gillian, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that something to keep in mind is, what are your pay changes from year to year? Are we talking about a real shift in the elements of pay and how your pay is structured in terms of fixed versus at risk? Or are we talking about, you have an annual bonus program, it's really the same quantum or proportion of pay, but you've shifted the mix of performance elements a bit. In the first instance, where you really made significant changes to the pay mix or to the elements of pay, I agree, Broc. I think that's right up front. That's going to be in your executive summary. I think in a bit, we're going to talk a little about charts and things you can look at there. This would be something that I agree I love to see in a chart format or check marks. We've shifted these elements. If you're talking more about your performance changes, especially if it is less holistic, I would say, then I usually see those in the elements of pay themselves, those sections, and I think it can be quite effective there. You'll have a little bit more space to get into the shift. Why did you make the shift? What is different about your program this year? That's particularly true when you see, again, kind of those performance changes in an annual pay program, or when you're going from one multi-year PSU cycle to another, and for the most part, the structure is the same, but you've shifted some of those elements or what proportion is paid out based on a particular metric.
Yeah, one of the SEC's more interesting regulations is one that says if you have some thing that lends itself to a chart or graph format, please, we recommend that you do that. So it's interesting that that's an actual rule. So of course, companies have the flexibility, just like with their audit fees, and you put them in a tabular format or not, that's up to you. So what sort of graphs and tables do you see in the CD&A?
I think you can have a lot of effective use of graphs and tables in the CD&A, but you also want to be thoughtful about it. In particular, if you readers are going to be comparing year over year. So that's one thing that I like to think about when I review a proxy statement. Is this a graph or a table that is going to be helpful year over year? Is it very particular to something happening this year so it won't look surprising when it's gone next year? Or is this a table that your readers are going to come to expect, and some years is going to look great and some years is going to either not look great or be just confusing based on what's happening? So some of the tables and graphs that I think are most effective are actually pay mix tables. You see those a lot in pie charts, where you'll see a fixed pay versus variable pay. You'll see the equity equity award pie charts where it's a certain proportion of options, time-based vesting RSUs, and performance RSUs, things of that nature. I think those are extremely helpful. They're visual, and they are sustainable year over year to the extent that you still have those parts of your compensation program. Sometimes I think people try to shoehorn things into charts and graphs, in particular when explaining pay-for-performance alignment. Sometimes that works very well. Sometimes it doesn't work very well, and you can do more with narrative. Or when you have the graphs where you're comparing what's happening with your CEO to all other NEOs, I think that's an area that can be effective, but you want to be very careful with labeling and making sure people are understanding what you're showing. Along with graphs, I think if we're talking about things like tables as charts where you have lists, sometimes you'll see now these quadrant-based presentations, which I think can be very effective, instead of just the lists of the checks and the X's that we used to see and still see. Now you're seeing more of a quadrant-based, like here's what we're doing for culture. Here's what we're doing with respect to financial performance. And those layouts, especially as companies choose to add more color and graphic design to their presentations, can be very effective as well.
I think that's a really great overview of the use of charts and graphs. I would just add that in addition to the ones Gillian mentioned, the realized and realizable pay of the CEO and the NEOs has really come into existence because of the issuers looking at maybe some drawbacks to the SEC rules with respect to how they're required to disclose pay. So I've been in a number of situations at a couple of issuers where putting in a graph or a pictorial of how much of the pay awarded to the CEO is actually realized in a particular year or would be realizable in a future year is helpful to showing investors a little bit of a different view than what they're going to see in the summary comp table. And it's certainly one that is often material to investors in their understanding. And to your point, Gillian, of not forcing it, I've found that those do work well in a sort of a graph or a pictorial perspective. And it's easy to point to when you talk to your investors or you have a discussion with a proxy advisor or something like that.
Yeah. One thing, you'll probably have a separate session on pay ratio, Broc, but I think it'll be interesting to see in particular this year whether we're seeing some of those realizable or realized pay translate into other ways of additional disclosure around pay ratio, in particular in this year when, of course, it's been a tough time for many employees from a compensation perspective.
Yeah, and I just take the vid guide with the proxy designer about the what we do, what we don't do chart. And of course, that helps the proxy advisors and the institutional investors quickly realize on their checklist, is this company doing something they shouldn't be doing? And there's that list of what we don't do and then list of what we do, just a very smart chart to have. And
yeah, and it's not directly in the CD&A, but a really smart chart are the ones that you put at the top of your equity plan proposals that also can speak directly to the proxy advisors who are going to be making advisory assessments on your equity plans. Those charts up front that just right away tell them what they're looking for. I think that's a great point, Broc, to think about your chart. Is it telling our readers what they're looking for? Is a good way to assess it as well.
so Raj, the typical CD&A is, I don't know, 20, 30 pages, probably. I should know that statistic, but I don't. 20 pages, 25, that's what I think. Anyways, what about executive summaries for the CD&A so it makes it more helpful for an investor, a shareholder to quickly get to what they want to, or is that just adding to an overly long disclosure anyways?
No, I think they're great. And over the years, we've kind of moved from a summary of the CD&A to a summary of the summary in the proxy statement summary. And I think they're all great because the feedback that I've heard from investors is all about being able to find what they need when they need it because they're so inundated with information on the various companies whose proxies they have to vote. So I think executive summaries are great. As Gillian had mentioned, there are a number of different things that are going on with comp in a year, but what are really the material items, either year over year or within the year, that are important to convey to investors? and not just the decisions, but the why. What's the message we're trying to get across with respect to the pay program in a particular year. It's a really effective way of getting those messages out there to set the stage for the reader as they go into the document, and they kind of anchor on what's in that executive summary. So it enables you to have them anchor on particular messages as they go through the data. And I think it's very consistent with sort of the thoughts behind the executive summary of the MD&A as well. Let's give that bigger picture of how we as management, as we as the comp committee are thinking about the comp program and what are those material elements. So Broc, big fan of the executive summary.
So Raj, you have such an unusual background in that this is the fourth time you've been in-house. So one, you've had the historical perspective, and of course the disclosure requirements have changed over time. But in terms of the actual process, who's on the primary team of drafting the CD&A, and then who are like sort of the secondary players, and then the calendar for all that, can you kind of walk us through a little bit of what your process is these days?
Yeah, it's a Herculean effort. It has been since the beginning because there's so much coordinating that needs to be taking place between the various functions and stakeholders within the company, and then some external folks as well. So typically in November, after the filing of the third quarter 10Q, we'll sit down with the core team. It's usually me and a paralegal, as well as some folks on the compensation and benefits team, to work on a calendar that really sets out all the deadlines that we know about and that we'll have, and how we're going to get the document drafted and then reviewed by the internal senior management, as well as reviewed by the compensation consultant, the compensation committee, and then any elements that need to go to the nom-gov committee or the full board towards hitting, whether it's notice and access or whatever other deadlines we might have for proxy season, and how are we positioning our shareholder outreach within the context of that. So the key stakeholders, as I mentioned, would be legal, executive compensation or HR, finance, sometimes internal audit, and then the compensation committees, the liaison to the compensation committee, the comp consultant, and our proxy solicitor.
And would you say the process has changed over the years, with your other companies?
Oh, that's a great question. Make me feel old, Broc, but I would say that I think it's a bit smoother now. I think the drafting is smoother. I think, folks within the company are very familiar with this. I think in the first years, there was a lot of time spent in drafting sessions and really explaining what we're being asked to disclose and why. I think now executives are very familiar with it. Board members are very familiar with it. They're very familiar with what proxy advisors are looking for in their roles. And drafting sessions will come in, particularly on issue-specific items where we want to make sure we've captured the detail and the message with respect to particular decisions, as opposed to the blank sheet and then drafting the whole thing together with a series of sessions. So that's certainly been one change in terms of the process. When
you do change company, I imagine there's always sort of some adjustment period where you're figuring out how this board works, how this compensation committee works, how the other members of the drafting team are. It's very interesting. So what is the specific role of the compensation committee? Do you actually sit down in a compensation committee meeting and go line by line over the draft disclosure with them? Or is it more of you send it out to them and they send back any comments or questions that they might have? So that's a great question. And actually, referring to something that Gillian said before, throughout the course of the year, there'll be compensation decisions that the compensation committee will vote on. Say, for example, a compensation award or retention package or hiring of a new executive. And at those times, we're talking to them about the disclosure that might be a real-time current report on Form 8K, or how this will be disclosed in the CD&A. So they have a generally good awareness of what the issues or what the hot topics for the year will be. And as we go into the proxy season in November, we're talking to them about our shareholder outreach. What feedback have we gotten from our investors? What did we share with them with respect to the say on pay vote and the executive comp programs? What are the new developments with respect to executive compensation amongst peer groups and generally in the S&P 500, for example? And then finally,
what are the things that we're going to be needing to do, whether it's a shareholder proposal for a plan or what have you. And then a draft is put together, and they get a chance to review drafts in connection with the tables, and then they get a final sign off towards the end, where they're basically approving the inclusion to the annual report, if you will, which is a formal thing, as well as the compensation committee report element on which they have to sign off.
And then there's a full board resolution. Is that in a resolution form or just approval in the minutes?
It's typically, it could be either one, actually, depending on the formality within the board. I prefer a formal resolution.
Jumping off something Raj mentioned, often when we're working with clients and they're going to their compensation committee for a new decision, we do pro forma disclosure drafting to show them as well along with that. And it can be helpful for the process itself, not just the disclosure drafting, because it can really highlight elements that will be called out in the disclosure, which can help, I think, those making the decisions kind of hone in and say, okay, is that exactly how we wanted this to work? And sometimes there can be a bit of a feedback between that pro forma disclosure and actually making some slight tweaks sometimes to the program.
So the annual studies of investors show that the CD&A tends to be the most important part of the proxy that they're interested in. But which specific parts within the CD&A, Raj, are they interested in? We already heard Gillian talk about the performance targets, but is there anything else that they're keenly interested in? I guess it depends on the circumstances, of course. If you've got a near failure on your say-on pay, that's going to probably lead to a lot of questions. But in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Any particular items for a year of concern, they're also going to focus in on those. I like to think that they do pay attention to the executive summary, what's in there, what's different. And then I think moving on from there, as you think about drafting your CD&A, there's so much detail that's both required and then oftentimes necessary to put in there. I think the things that I've seen that are consistently of interest to the various stakeholders. One would be the lead-in paragraphs, which you normally see, where the company will talk about its performance in the year, how it performed on its metrics, and how that informed the payout. And they'll be looking once again at the return on investment, the return on capital, whatever net income, profit, and revenue metrics you had, how you performed, and then how your executives got paid. Very basic there. They're really interested in any cash compensation. So discretionary cash awards, spot bonuses that aren't linked to the variable compensation or that weren't given in the form of options or performance share units or that kind of thing. I think they're very focused on executive departures and retirements. How are those handled and why, and what kind of gave impetus to that? And then the CEO's comp seems to be something that's always of interest. And how would you look at that performance against the bonus metrics that were set up with respect to how he or she was paid out, and any changes year over year and how that is, or what's the continuum year over year. So those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
So in wrapping up, I think we promised Gillian's daughter that this video would get at least 1 million views. So everyone, please start from the beginning and watch it 4 more times.
She'll
Thanks
be
so much.
happy.
And she would love it. My mama's a YouTube star.
She's finally famous.
Thank you so much, Raj. Thank you so much, Gillian. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you both.